Jinhsi is here, and she has a kit that's almost as big as her damage. I'll explain to you exactly how she works, and then dive into some calculations for her sequence nodes, best builds, weapons, and teammates, and also some example rotations for how she plays. Let's get into it. Jinhsi is a character centered completely around her burst. Without setup, her on-field ratios leave something to be desired. In order to do big damage, you need to do 3 things. Enter flying mode, basic attack 4 times, and then press her enhanced skill. So, how do we enter flying mode? By either using your basic attack combo or intro, you'll gain access to her second skill, which puts you in flying mode, Incarnation. Because of how bad the basic combo damage is, and also because of the Celestial Light 5-piece effect, you'll typically only want to enter this via an intro. During the Incarnation state, your attacks will be empowered and count as skill damage, and you'll gain a new, more powerful skill, Radiant Crescent. After doing 4 basic attacks in this mode, it will wear off and grant access to an even more powerful skill, Illuminous Epiphany, and this is her hardest hitting skill, which scales significantly with her Forte stacks. Due to how the base damage is only a very small fraction of the maximum potential damage, you'll want to get as many of these stacks as possible. So, let's talk about those. Jinhsi has 12 different flavors of incandescent stacks. 1 for each element, and then 1 specifically for coordinated attacks. Again, for each element. These different flavors all have their own independent proc timers, with normal elemental procs giving a single stack each, but coordinated attacks giving 2 stacks at a time. Additionally, coordinated attacks can double dip on both their own category and the general elemental category, meaning that they could give up to 3 stacks in a single proc if you aren't proccing that element otherwise. Because of this, there is huge value in having varied element teammates in your party, especially if they have coordinated attacks in their kit. Characters such as Yuanwu and Yinlin are especially powerful. Verina, despite being spectral, is still a great pick due to her general buffing capabilities, and funnily enough, still provides more stacks than Baiji due to how Baiji's proc intervals are extremely scuffed. Normally, Incandescence can only be stacked in each category once per 3 seconds, shortened to 1 second after Jinhsi's outro. You could see how Baiji's awkward 2.5 second proc interval fails to deliver here. Jinhsi's damage split is very heavily skewed towards skill damage, with the biggest damage split we've seen in characters so far. We'll talk about how this affects build options later on. That's pretty much all you need to know about her kit. Her inherent skills are just passive buffs, one of which waters down the bonus damage multiplier quite a bit. Anyway, let's move on to her sequence nodes. The following calculations were simulated in a context of Jinhsi, Yuanwu, and Verina, using Jinhsi's signature weapon, Ages of Harvest, with 2 rotations. For more information on the parameters and results, please check the description for a link to my DPS calculator. First is our S1, which grants a stacking buff that increases the damage of Illuminous Epiphany. Due to how the rotation is executed, this is pretty much always fully stacked. While 80% bonus damage for her biggest nuke sounds great, note that this modifier is extremely diluted by spectral damage and bonus damage lines from your stats. In an endgame scenario, the expected DPS gain from this is around 10%. It's not 80%, but it's certainly a decent gain. Her S2 grants full stacks of Incandescence when you are completely out of combat for 4 seconds. In content like Hologram and TOA, you'll get that one large starting burst, but for the purpose of these calculations that only use the first 2 rotations, I'll leave this effect out as to not inflate the value of it. Her S3 gives a stacking attack buff when using her intro, up to 2 stacks. This is a fairly chunky boost that is easy to maintain with the proper rotation, and is relatively a 13% gain in DPS from her S1. Next is her S4, which grants the entire team a damage bonus after using Illuminous Epiphany or her Liberation. This isn't worth as much in terms of boosting her own damage, but it's a very welcome sequence in teams with powerful sub-DPS such as Yinlin. Her S5 increases her Liberation's damage multiplier by 120%. While her Liberation has a huge modifier, it also has an equally huge energy cost and cooldown, so you'll only be getting this off once every other rotation. As such, this isn't a huge gain in terms of total DPS. Finally, her S6 is a multiplicative 45% increase on Illuminous Epiphany, including the damage bonus from stacks. This is every bit as strong as it sounds. In the next section, we'll look at her weapon options. The following damage calculations will use the same base team of Jinhsi, Yuanwu, and Verina, all at S0. For the purpose of comparisons, we'll consider the 5-star standard weapon, Lustrous Razor, as the baseline 100% metric at R1. The first is her signature weapon, Ages of Harvest. It synergizes with her perfectly, granting massive boosts to skill damage, and is quite a jump over Lustrous Razor at R1, with double the jump at R5. Gion's signature weapon, Verdant Summit, primarily boosts heavy attack damage, and as such, isn't as strong as an option. However, it still outshines Lustrous Razor due to its crit damage main stat on top of its elemental damage bonus. Helios Cleaver is a reliable 4-star option, as the buff lasts long enough to cover Jinhsi's burst window. Autumn Trace, the Battle Pass weapon, is an inferior choice due to how you never get any of its buffs in a typical rotation, but it holds up okay from its crit rate main stat. Finally, the crafted option, Broadblade 41, falls a bit flat due to its energy recharge passive. On top of that, you can lose the damage buff if your HP drops below 80%. Now let's move on to the Echo build. How do we optimize Echo stats on her? First, let's talk about the stat priorities, using a basic 4-3-3-1-1 build on her. Here's a graph with subset values, showing the relative gain of adding a median row of each of the following substats at 2 comparison points. The darker one represents the gain when you have absolutely 0 substats, and the lighter bar represents when you have a full substat build. The most desired substats are critical, attack percent, and skill percent. I know we just talked about flat attack in the previous video, but Jinhsi is a bit of an abnormal case due to how skill damage heavy she is. But that being said, note that a median flat attack value is 40, which is a good amount below average. If you compare a flat attack value of 50, it's actually better. While we're here, let's also talk about energy recharge. This varies a bit depending on your team. The shorter the general rotation, the more ER you'll need. In a Yuanwu team, for example, you'll need roughly 30% ER to have enough energy to ult every other rotation. However, in a Yinlin team, you'll only need around 3%, and in a Mortefi team, 14%. Now, how about the general Echo build itself? Due to how much skill damage Jinhsi is incentivized to stack, on top of her skill damage boosting signature weapon, free spectral damage passive, and sequence nodes, the bonus damage multiplier is extremely diluted. In the following section, we'll see how builds compare, using her R1 signature weapon. Note that with different weapons, the results may vary. Feel free to simulate your exact use case on the calculator. If you have a fleshed out build with a median skill damage percent line on each echo, a 43311 build with an attack percent 3 cost is actually better than the standard 43311 with double spectral percent, and a 44111 build is even better. If you have 0 skill damage percent lines, the opposite is true, though 44111 is only a measly 1% under 43311 in this case. However, recall that her S1 gives a huge damage bonus multiplier on a nuke. If we refresh the graph using an S1 simulation, you can now see that the gap between the 43311 builds widens in favor of attack and ela percent, as well as the 44111 build. If we look at her S6, the 44111 build pulls ahead further. Though all these builds are fairly close to each other at the end of the day. Whichever one is best for you really hinges on what rolls the best, as the difference between the best and worst builds at each point is just a difference of at most a couple stat rolls. Finally, let's talk about team comps. We'll use a base team of Jinhsi and Verina, alongside an additional supportive unit. Let's quickly look at an overview of the expected DPS of each of these teams. If Yinlin is geared with Screenmaster, she is easily the strongest ally for Jinhsi out of these 4, even at S0. Running her on Electro set is a damage gain over trying to run support with Heron. If given less premium of a weapon, expect the results to diminish by quite a bit. Mortefi, while good on paper, doesn't work too well with Jinhsi. His coordinated attacks only proc on normal and heavy attacks, meaning only Verina will be proccing them, as Jinhsi's attacks in Incarnation all count as skill damage. At S1, he does a coordinated attack on skill cast, but this also doesn't apply to Incarnation attacks, only the actual skill itself. At S6, his contribution to the total party's DPS is much higher, but still roughly on par with Yuanwu. Yuanwu is the ultimate budget ally. He doesn't need much field time, he doesn't need much gear, and most importantly, he doesn't even need a 4-star weapon. He'll instead happily take Originite and run the Healing Echo set. As such, he doesn't really have much room to grow. Better gear, weapons, or sequences don't really increase the damage potential by much at all. The main drawback is that he requires you to stand in the little circle around his Thunder Wedge. As such, you may end up further than normal from the theoretical maximum DPS in most situations. Finally, we have Taoqi. Having a massive 38% skill damage amplified outro makes her an extremely tempting choice for Jinhsi. And honestly, she is the best teammate for increasing your DPS. If DPS means damage per screenshot, yes, 38% skill damage amplify is a lot. But building Taoqi's outro takes so long that even if you do ultra sweaty, frame perfect, optimized quick swap tech, the overall DPS of a rotation with Taoqi building up her outro is actually less than if you did literally nothing on her. And trust me, I tried to cook this rotation so hard. Even with R5 Discord, it's just not happening. She is also doing a huge disservice to Jinhsi by not having any coordinated damage in her kit to help build stacks. All of these team comps have a very similar rotation. The general premise is start on Jinhsi and use her Echo and skill. Then swap to your support. Use their initial skills before doing Verina's 0 to 100 outro combo, and then outro to Jinhsi and do her burst combo. It's important to rush the first burst as fast as possible, so we have the shortened interval for stack generation from Jinhsi's outro. I have cooked long rotations, including the opener and the follow-up loop that comes afterward for all of these characters. Check the calculator in the description for more info. Just to show what these rotations look like, let's go through an example with Yuanwu. Start out on Jinhsi and tap your Echo as well as her skill, and then swap out to Yuanwu. After his basic attack connects, use his skill, followed by his Echo, and swap out to Verina. Use her swap in basic attack 345, cancel it with her liberation, and then use her skill, jump cancel it, and do a couple mid-air attacks to use her stacks. Use Heron and swap to Jinhsi, tapping her skill twice, and then using her liberation. Do your basic attack combo, then tap your skill again for the massive nuke. Instantly switch to Verina and swap out of her to Yuanwu as soon as possible to avoid her long intro animation. Use his skill and liberation, then switch back to Verina for basic attack 345, cancelling it with her skill and then 3 mid-air attacks, and then outro to Jinhsi and repeat her burst the same as before, while tapping her Echo immediately. And that's about it for the guide. For more detailed information on all the rotations, including the entire buff table, each individual proc, etc., check out my DPS calculator, linked in the description. I've poured hundreds of hours into this since the last video to make it the ultimate theorycraft tool, though I still have some older characters to be added still. Do check it out and craft your own rotation. Bye bye!